I've always hated this saying. It's just never really made sense to me. Like, how can your destination not matter? And how can the journey mean more? And on top of that, it's just repeated so often that it's basically become meaningless. See, that's what I thought, anyway, until my spring break of 2018, when I took a road trip with a friend to the Badlands National Park. On that particular trip, the phrase, "it's not about the destination, it's about the journey," began to take on a whole new meaning.
This is the start to one of the greatest adventures that man has ever known. 2 young boys, a fully packed Miata, and a trip to South Dakota to see the lands that are bad. Keenan, what are your thoughts starting out?
Real scared because these lands are said to be real bad.
We planned the trip over spring break. From Kansas City, the drive was only supposed to be 9 hours, so we figured we could do it in one day. The drive up through Iowa was uneventful, but once we hit South Dakota, small flurries began to blow across the highway. As we drove into Sioux Falls, the snowfall began to get a little heavier. I figured it was just a small storm and that it would pass. This was the point in our trip that we made the first of 2 critical errors. Once we were 40 miles or so outside of Sioux Falls, we were smack in the middle of an actual blizzard.
I'm actually kind of afraid for it to get dark.
Oh, and just to reiterate, we were driving a Mazda Miata, a rear-wheel drive 6-inch lift lightweight sports car. Things were about to get fun. We figured we would keep driving and eventually we would have to reach the end of the storm. Well, that was what we thought anyway, before we spun out the first time. We were going around 40 miles an hour when a sudden gust of wind began to blow us counterclockwise. I tried to correct the car, but at that point, the roads were so icy that we just spun off. We sat for a minute, not really knowing what to do. I tried to back the car out, but of course it didn't budge. I stepped out of the car to survey the situation, and as soon as I stepped out, my hat was blown clean off my head. And then, suddenly, a white truck came out of the blizzard and stopped right next to us. An aged Native American man stepped out, and he said 4 words. "I tow you out." He gave us some straps, and within a couple minutes, we were up and on the road again. We began to try to remove the straps, but at this point they were so frozen that we basically just couldn't get them off. The man asked us if we had a knife, and we said yes. And he said, "Cut them off." And we did. And then after doing that, he just drove off into the blizzard again. Things only went downhill from there. We were blown off the highway that first day a total of 4 times. After the 4th time, a highway patrol woman happened to drive by and assisted us in getting back on the road. She also happened to mention that the interstate had been closed before we had even gotten on it. Here's the morning after. We're trying to clean off our car.
As you can see, we've got some major damage here. We had to clean all this stuff off. Yep, We got Keenan using a handy ice scraper. Car used to look like that, but now it looks like that. Let's talk about a major remodel. Look at this snowbank. Look at that. Can't tell where the car ends and the snowbank begins.
The next morning, it had stopped snowing, but the roads were not clear and the highway wasn't going to open until 5 p.m. It was at this moment that we made the second critical error of our trip. We decided to not wait for the interstate to open, and instead took to the back roads to see if we could drive around the closed section of highway. This worked just as well as you'd imagine.
Are we streaming to all of our fans?
Yeah, we're live right now.
Yeah, we out here, Highway 34, South Dakota. We've got roads that are barely drivable. We've only spun out once today though, so that's a pretty good start. We don't want to skid out around here because if we skid out, then we're gonna end up down in that snowbank. No one's gonna be able to find us. We're gonna be stuck out here. So we're just gonna try to stay on the road. That's generally advisable.
Around 4 o'clock, we were almost back to the interstate, only having a 50-mile stretch through desolate windswept plains to get through. This was when we spun out for the final time. We mounted a hill and were on the downward slope when suddenly the wheel jerked out of my hand and we spun into the opposite lane. I tried to correct, but it was too late. We slid down an incline into a deep bank of snow. We tried to push the car out, but of course it didn't budge. We then tried to put sticks under the wheels so they could get traction. This didn't help either. We then took out an ice pick and attempted to dig tracks in the snow for the tires. We began to feel a little panicked. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no guarantee a tow truck would even be able to reach us since we were so far down the incline. We began to get a little desperate. I started to attack the snow in front of the tires furiously with the ice pick, even though I knew it wouldn't help. We sat down in the car for a minute, silent, not really knowing what to do. I began to think. By all metrics, our journey to the Badlands had been a disastrous waste of time. We had been lucky to get as far as we did without hurting ourselves or seriously damaging our car. To be so close to the interstate, so close to our goal, and to be stopped by something we just couldn't control was heartbreaking. Then, cutting through the silence was the sound of a car. Two 20-something guys pulled up and asked if we needed a hand, and together all four of us pushed the car back up the incline and onto the road. At this point, so much ice was on our wheels that we had to jack up the car and attack the frozen blocks with a wrench and a knife. After about 20 minutes, we had managed to get most of it off. We got to the interstate without issue, finding it totally clear, and within an hour we arrived in the Badlands. Overall, the trip had taken 18 hours, double the time it was supposed to. We learned later that I had inadvertently driven us straight into one of the worst snowfalls South Dakota had received in 5 years. The southern part of the state received 9 inches of snow and winds up to 65 miles an hour. But, in spite of all of that, we still had an amazing time. The drive was exhausting, terrifying, and beautiful all at the same time. We got to spend hours talking, listening to music, reading, and admiring the landscape. And somehow, I think the Badlands were even more gorgeous after all of the pain it took in getting there. The snow and the poor road conditions made us really appreciate the true beauty of the national park. So, maybe the maxim is a little correct. I think a more accurate saying would be that the destination and the journey are equally important. The Badlands wouldn't have been quite so beautiful if getting there hadn't been quite so difficult. If this trip has taught me anything, it's that the struggle of getting what you want amplifies the meaning of the thing and vice versa. I guess it's just nice to know that if one of those things goes wrong, you'll always have the other.